Our next speaker, then, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Fergus Gracey, who is an Associate Professor in Clinical Psychology at the University of East Anglia and an Honorary Consultant Neuropsychologist in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Foundation Trust. And Fergus is well known for bringing a range of creative kind of therapies into the rehabilitation space. So thank you very much, Fergus.
Thank you, Liam, and thanks also to Kirsten and the organisers for inviting me. It's really a real great privilege to be here and also to have the opportunity to talk about some work that I've been doing with my inspiring collaborators, Charlie Whiffin, Ali Norman, and Caroline Ellis-Hill, and others who've contributed, but primarily those people. It's just brilliant to have John's talk come before mine and to kind of set the stall of the neuropsychological rehabilitation space, one that I inhabited as a clinician very fully for about 15 years, and then I've gone on to work in academia and research and trying to understand more about the things that interested me in neuropsychological rehabilitation, the kinds of problems that we're trying to address. And I guess in short, the key challenges that I've been interested in have been the things sort of on the fringe of the kind of formally represented, formally described aspects of rehabilitation. So all the things that John has described, and obviously that's sort of evolved over the years. But on the fringes of that, I've often felt like there's a bit of a disconnection when you sit down to do a psychological therapy with someone and they've been referred for anger management or depression treatment. But that's not how people talk. There's a bit of a disconnection when you're doing your sort of executive rehab and people get it in the session, but it doesn't get implemented in day-to-day life. So the things that have interested me has really been, what is it that we need to change about how we do our practice to bridge the gap between what we think and do as professionals in a rehabilitation space and what people's lives are actually like. And this particular area of work, using creativity, is one that's really helped me to think about that disconnection in a different way. And I have to credit particularly Caroline Ellis-Hill, but the collaborators that have kind of helped me on this journey over about 10, 12 years. So why consider creativity particularly in rehabilitation? Well, we've heard from John what rehabilitation looks like, neuropsychological rehabilitation, a brilliant exposition of the components, how we work, restoration, compensation, strategies, support, the emotional element, formulation, understanding and meaning, working towards outcomes that relate sort of emotion and well-being and quality of life, more or less founded on the WHO ICF framework. And as I say, I think the question that I've had throughout is, does this address the complete impact of ABI? And the first question that I had for me in my work as a neuropsychologist doing rehabilitation was, what are we doing about identity? How are we thinking about and addressing the fact that everyone who's coming through the doors is saying, I want the old me back. I want to do something that addresses the fact that I don't feel like how I used to be. I'm not who I used to be. And what are we doing that explicitly addresses and makes that the sort of fundamental place? And so I'm not going to talk about the Y-shaped model, and now I actually am, so that's wrong. But my way into that was working with John and others at the Oliver Zengel Centre, developing the Y-shaped model to think about how we make identity central to the rehabilitation process. I was invited to a stroke research network meeting where they were wanting to bring together people who were writing and thinking about the psychological consequences of stroke. And I met Caroline Ellis-Hill, and we'd just published the Y-shaped model, and she had read that, and she'd just published the life thread model, and I'd just read that. So it was a very exciting meeting. Essentially, the life thread model is kind of similar to the Y-shaped model in that it represents a way of thinking about identity change following stroke or brain injury. It's based on Caroline's PhD, where she interviewed people who'd had a stroke and their family members. And it represents identity as like a rope made up of multiple strands. And each of these, so the entirety of our identity is the rope. And the rope is made up of individual kind of narrative strands, the stories that we have about ourselves, the stories that we tell about ourselves, the stories that we live with others, and the stories that we have about what we might do in the future. And after a stroke, or a brain injury, the idea is that some of those strands are broken, some of those stories are kind of halted. I can't do this anymore, I can't be that person anymore. But not all of them. There are stories about who we are that might continue, that are still connected. I guess this orientates us to the whole of the individual, not just the breaks. And there's a slight risk in some traditional rehabilitation approaches that we might lean towards where the deficit is, where the break is, where the problem is. Even in my work with sort of identity discrepancy, the focus is on the discrepancy rather than the continuity. But to address that discrepancy, you'd want to focus on that continuity. So Caroline and I got talking and thinking about the ways in which this work could be carried forward in a sort of intervention type way or in a supportive type way. And Caroline at that time was then working with a group of phenomenological researchers who were very interested in just kind of radically new ways of thinking about being with people who are in crisis in different ways, in different settings. But for Caroline's work and some of the team there at Bournemouth University, that was about thinking about stroke and brain injury and that kind of thing. So some of the principles that came from this is about thinking, when you're thinking about identity and identity changes, endorsing a positive view of self. So we're thinking not about the deficit or the loss necessarily, we're recognizing that, but also thinking about the continuity of what still makes that person, and trying to bring that to the fore again. There's a real emphasis in this work on being on the context, so being with the person as a sort of interpersonal way of validating who they are, allowing time for them to speak, allowing time for them to experience who they are. And seeing acquired disability as a time of transition. There's lots of words that are used, and I don't think I've got the right one yet. Caroline's really made me think about this. I was still talking about adjustment when I met her, and she sort of frowned at me a little bit and sort of said, well, we're thinking really adjustment. How many of you are adjusted? Can I just ask that question? Like, is it an actual human thing that we do? And we talk about it as if it is for our brain injured people, but none of us are doing that. So why should we sort of impose that on people? Actually, what's more common in our lives is identity transition, leaving home, going through bereavements, all of these different things. They're identity transitions. They're times when we come to recognize things are moving and changing in our lives. And some of these principles have been more recently articulated in the humanization approach to practice, which Caroline Ellis-Hill and others have talked about. And which is, again, founded on this sort of phenomenological set of principles, which I'm not going to go into detail about. Essentially, there's a heavy focus, though, in this work on the context, on the sort of interpersonal context. And obviously, in John's talk, there's a heck of a lot of content goes into rehab. And this isn't to diminish that, but it's to set that alongside a focus on the context and what we provide. So in that rehabilitation activity, we can ask ourselves, are we being present? Are we being open and curious? Are we creating a safe space, etc.? And if you then start thinking about, and I've certainly been there myself, how diligently I've tried to set SMART goals, etc. with someone and kind of persevere to try to get to the SMART goal of that thing. To what extent is that about being open and curious and in the moment and being present, etc.? So Caroline and I, we've also had these sort of discussions about where does goal setting sit, because it seems at odds with some of the principles here, and yet it is also an important thing that we should probably be doing. So it throws up some dilemmas. But this is where creativity comes in, what I'm going to do is talk about a few examples of the kinds of projects that I've been doing with this group of people where we've been exploring different applications of creativity. So this includes use of arts-based approaches, which is sort of creating context within which people can explore their identity after stroke through an arts and health approach. The use of wool and stones, so just some physical materials to help people to pursue their own sort of mental journey, I guess, in telling a story about their life and adjusting or adapting to their situation. And the use of a sort of physical representation of the life threads to support families after a TBI. So the first one was the Heart of Stroke project, which you can read about in the paper in 2019. And this was group artwork within 1 year after a stroke, with an artist who was not an art therapist, purely and not training the person in art techniques, but using an arts and health approach. So this is about just creating a space in which a group of half a dozen people who'd had a stroke would come in. There'd be a whole range of materials, items that they could explore. It didn't have to be necessarily visual art. People could write or bring photos or choose materials that the artist had brought. And the idea was to create a space in which people just explored the creative impulse. So when you pick something up, when you pick up a brush, when you pick up a stone or a stick or something, a shell, that might trigger a creative response and take you off on a journey. And the idea here is that people will then go off on those journeys, and in doing so, elements of your identity become sort of formalized, become expressed. People were remembering things. They were talking with the other members of the group about aspects of their lives that maybe they'd forgotten about, etc. So there was this very organic human process. There was very little in the way of content. It was all about setting the conditions within people would just explore their creative impulse over the weeks of the group. People talked about an increase in confidence. People talked about feeling joy and about feeling positivity. People talked about the connection that they made with other people. They also reflected on things like not thinking of themselves as a creative person, like I'm not an artist, but somehow this was nevertheless something that they felt that they could do because there was no expectation of the art being good, as it were. So that's one example of kind of using this creative process. The next example, we're just finishing off work on this with two clinical psychology doctoral trainees at UEA, Lauren Davies and Deborah Spencer. And this has been using these materials of wool and stones, different types of wool, different types of stone, and bringing that into the sort of qualitative data collection when we're interviewing parents of children who've had a brain injury to see how engaging with these physical materials, drawing on experience of the arts and health group in stroke. Do people discover new things or different things if telling their story whilst having the option of using these materials? So there are two parts to the research, and Lauren did part one. So what are the narratives that arise from the parents of a child who sustained a brain injury when using this wool and stones approach? And part two is about then interviewing the parents about their experience of using the approach. You know, is this completely batty, weird stuff that, you know, we should just kind of leave in the cupboard and walk away from? Or is there something in it that brings something different to our usual sort of talk-based ways of doing things? So individual parents were provided materials and invited to share their story and use the materials if or how they wanted to in a completely free way with sort of no judgment and no instruction. So here are some illustrations of things that people did. So over on the left there, this particular parent was talking and wrapping up the stones with wool and in a sort of almost sort of non-conscious way. And when the interview had finished, and Lauren sort of fed back to Deborah that I don't think she really did it. She was just sort of wrapping up the stones in wool. But then when Deborah did her interview with it, there was a really clear narrative about the importance of what each of those stones represented, the power and emotion that was in them, and it was her way of trying to keep all of that overwhelming trauma at bay whilst talking about her heartfelt story about her child's brain injury. So it really did seem to access something that wasn't necessarily present in the verbal aspect of the interview. It did seem to be tapping into something. And these are the themes that came from Lauren's part of the study. I'm going to skip through because of time. We then asked people about their experience of the process, and we found out how people then were able to kind of talk about these different things. So the first theme was about piecing together the story, and this captured mapping the journey, so using the wool and stones to help them to kind of express the story that they wanted to tell, and also owning the narrative. So there was something about being able to use the materials which made it which helped them to make it their story. So, for example, this one reminded me of when my daughter was suicidal, and I was terrified she was going to. I think it was just the texture that brought that to my mind. So this is something about interacting with the materials and what that evokes in terms of connecting with personal experience. And then in terms of owning the narrative, it would have come to the surface sometime, and I think maybe it was my choice that it came to the surface last week during the interview with the materials. So I'm in control of it. So something about having the materials, it makes it personal, it makes it sort of controllable. Engaging with the process is about the kind of, as it says, it's about engaging with the process. So feeling safe enough to share. It was really nice to talk about the journey with someone that doesn't know me. There's no judgment, so a key part of the process. I did keep looking at the bag, but in my head I was like, I don't know what to do with it. So there was an element of trepidation, uncertainty in engaging with the materials. And this meant that for some, it wasn't for everyone. They didn't want to go there. It felt either too overwhelming or a bit like, I don't want to do the creative thing. That's not me, so they would rather just keep it at arm's length. You're using your brain as well as the materials. You've got that sensitivity on your fingers, and I think it just flew. And this is exactly what the life world-led approach that Caroline Ellis-Hill and others have described is about. It's about what happens if you think about what we carry in our bodies, the experience of our lives, and what can be released when we engage in a very human sort of creative process. That it's just happening in her hands as she tells the story. The final area that I'd like to talk about, or application, is the Life Threads approach. And this is work led by Charlie Whiffin and was very much inspired by Caroline's Life Threads model. And the question was, like, if we created a physical representation of those threads and used that as the kind of creative material people might work with, could that be quite an interesting way to help people think about identity change? And the focus here again was on family members of adult survivors of a traumatic brain injury. We are just in the process of, so the link, the QR code up there is to the protocol paper, and we've submitted the full write-up of this. And so essentially, with some co-production work with family members of people who'd had a brain injury, Charlie developed this kind of box of materials that you can see pictures of there on the screen. And then the study design, we basically did focus groups with people, we introduced them to the materials, we explained about the study, they got to know one another, and then we posted them this sort of brown box, cardboard box with these materials in. I think it comes up on the next slide. Yeah, you can see it over there on the left-hand side, the kind of what came in the box, this kind of chunk of threads of wool, some various instructions and information, some different labels of different sizes, and it kind of explains about the Life Threads model and kind of suggests, like, you could use this to think about your own story. So we posted it to people, we gave them a month for them to do exactly what they wanted with it. Put it in a drawer and let it gather dust, get it out and play with it with your family, with your brain-injured relative, just use it personally or privately. There were no sort of instructions other than some guidance as to how you might use it. And so in the end, we recruited 17 family members. 11 reported finding it definitely helpful. A few sort of yes, but, and we're not sure, and 2 no. And the 2 no people were people who were very long post their relative's injury, and they had accessed support previously and therapy previously, and felt that it wasn't really adding anything. I shan't go into the details of the of each of the themes, but it's similar to what I described in the Wool and Stone. So we had this sort of element of being able to kind of tell the story. So we had a lot of content that was about the trauma of family members, and a lot about the fact that they'd never been invited to tell their own story and had felt really outside of the loop within rehabilitation services, most often being included as a sort of a proxy for the brain-injured person rather than in their own right. So that was a huge and very impactful part of the data. And then we had a degree of this sort of the process by which they represented their story using the wool and using the life threads and the labels, etc. Some were a little put off by the lack of structure and feeling they're not creative. Many felt that being offered the materials felt like an invitation or a permission to think about themselves and to do it at their own time and in their own way, so it's not like therapist-led. And there was a real diversity of how people did that, and some people, like one chap opened the box, he thought, I can't think about this. He put the wool in his pocket and he went on a walking trip for a long weekend or a week, and he had it in his pocket and he was thinking about his dad's stroke, his dad's head injury, while he was doing the walking. So it was there, but he wasn't sort of doing it. He was sort of doing it and not doing it. People have very unique ways in which they engage with the material. So we think it has potential to give voice and ownership in a way that's controlled by the family members. So in conclusion, creativity causes us to make space for possibility in research and potentially also in clinical or social care practice. And there's emerging evidence for the potential to draw on this. I think we need to do further co-production work, and I think we need to explore this further to understand the different contexts in which it might be used, and including working with people from diverse cultures, etc., in the types of things that we're doing in this space. And it's part of our wider work on identity adaptation and transition around the family, around community participation and social connection. And I've come to a screeching halt on my final slide. So thanks again to all of our collaborators. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fergus. That was brilliant, and I'm sure you saw lots of therapists nodding their approval and recognition of the things you were saying. So we've not got time for questions just now, but Fergus has got a fascinating workshop later, and there'll be a chance to see him outside of the session.